Okay, so let's dive into this. We've got a really interesting set of sources here, mainly essays looking at this idea of the open society, a lot from a 2018 book called Rethinking Open Society. Feels, well, pretty relevant right now.
It really does. And our goal here, for this deep dive is to unpack these texts. We want to pull out the core insights about what an open society is, where the idea came from, the big challenges it's facing, and how different thinkers suggest we might navigate all that.
Yeah, think of it as us guiding you through these ideas, because the sources make it clear this isn't just some dusty academic concept. It was hammered out after major crises, and while it's under real pressure again today, we want to help you get a quick handle on it.
Absolutely. The concept itself, open society, it's not ancient history. The sources really place its crystallization after 1945.
Yeah.
It was a direct response, intellectually and politically, to fascism and, of course, the Soviet totalitarian threat.
And the essays we've got highlight the key figures from back then, people like Karl Popper, Isaiah Berlin, J.L. Talman, Hayek, Hannah Arendt. It's also mentioned, kind of fascinatingly, that George Soros, founder of CEU, was actually Popper's student.
Right, and Popper's central question, as these sources frame it, it's actually quite practical, almost anti-utopian, you could say. It's how do we set up our politics so that even, bad or incompetent rulers can't do too much damage?
Not aiming for perfection, then. More like damage limitation for freedom.
Exactly. It's about safeguards, gradual defense, which connects really well with Hannah Arendt's view, also covered here. She, like Popper, was deeply suspicious of those big deterministic theories of history, like Marxism, that claim to know the future and then use that to justify, well, forcing people into line.
There's that quote from her in the sources, something like, caution in handling opinions that claim to explain whole trends of history is important, because the last century gave us so many ideologies claiming to be keys to history.
Yes, she called that kind of thinking coercive arrogance, a powerful phrase. The open society idea was partly a rebellion against anyone claiming that kind of certainty.
And Isaiah Berlin, he fits right into, doesn't he? With his idea that history has no libretto.
He embraced that uncertainty. The thinking, as presented, was kind of like, better to live with not knowing the future than to live under some kind of tyrannous certainty imposed from above.
But these sources really stress that Popper's vision of an open society, it's not the easy option. It asks a lot of
Oh,
us.
definitely. It demands you respect others, even when you profoundly disagree. It asks you to make reasoned choices when things aren't clear-cut. There are no easy solutions handed down. It puts the responsibility squarely on the individual, what Popper called carrying the cross of being human.
That really hits home. But the sources also point out a limitation, maybe a blind spot, for these founding thinkers. They call them Cold War liberals.
Right, meaning they largely operated within and sort of took for granted the institutional setup of liberal democratic constitutionalism as it existed then. And that setup, is part of a specific global order, the U.S. versus Soviet bloc world.
So the argument is, if you're looking for answers from Popper or Berlin about what to do when that whole framework is shaky, like maybe it is today,
Right.
you won't really find a remedy or even a critique in their work for that kind of crisis. Their focus was different, shaped by their time.
Still, despite that, the sources do talk about a kind of hidden strength of the open society model, something about knowledge.
Yes, it's democratic epistemology. The idea that knowledge isn't just decreed, it gets tested, challenged, evaluated competitively. Think courts, a free press, parliaments debating, universities researching.
So it's better at finding things out, essentially. That's the argument, that innovation flourishes, where ideas and information can circulate freely, where people can try things out to solve problems. Single-party states, they gamble, they can have innovation and control. The big question posed is, which system will actually deliver better for people's needs going forward?
Okay, so that sets the stage. But let's shift now to the internal problems, because these essays spend a lot of time on how open societies often struggle from within.
They really do. A major theme is that open societies frequently fail their own citizens. Things like huge companies, oligopolies, distorting markets, elites grabbing power, demagogues using hate and lies to win votes.
And that internal failure, it makes the alternative, the closed society, look tempting, doesn't it? Like an escape from difficult choices.
Exactly. The sources say we need a persuasive counterexample, but that lure of the closed system is persistent, and it's change shape, less old-school totalitarianism or these newer authoritarian styles.
One really interesting critique raised is that the early thinkers maybe didn't focus enough on things like, well, borders or social solidarity.
That feels incredibly relevant now,
Right.
right? The point made is you can't have solidarity, a feeling of us, without distinguishing from them.
Hmm.
And navigating that is really tough, especially with challenges like migration and refugees.
If there isn't that sense of shared identity or attention to the effective nature of politics, the emotional side, people can feel lost, like their country isn't theirs anymore.
Yeah, that sense of alienation is key. And this is where a conservative perspective, which is presented quite clearly in the sources, comes in with a really different starting point.
Oh, so?
Well, it challenges that classic liberal idea of the freely choosing individual as the baseline. The argument is those individuals don't just appear. They're shaped by a particular social order, by institutions, by norms. Emancipation itself is social. It depends on interacting with others, on being accountable.
So freedom isn't just about being left alone. It actually needs constraints.
That's the argument. Freedom needs the right kind of constraints to sustain the social order that makes free, responsible individuals possible in the first place. So the conservative question becomes, what constraints are essential, and how far can they be weakened before things fall apart?
That's a different way of looking at it. And this ties into another point they make about democracy needing more than just politics, right? Something about a first-person plural.
Yes, a pre-political loyalty. Like, neighborliness, maybe.
Yeah.
Based on shared place, language, customs, something that allows people who vote differently to still see each other as fellow citizens, to see the government, even if they don't like who's in charge, as fundamentally ours.
And they doubt if purely cosmopolitan ideals can provide that same glue as effectively as, say, national attachment.
That's the doubt expressed in that perspective, yeah. Which connects to another challenge the sources grapple with, modern identity politics.
Okay, what's the take there?
The analysis presented is that what started as movements for collective identity to claim equal rights for groups has, in some contexts, particularly universities, according to these authors, shifted more towards psychological self-definition and self-discovery.
And the concern raised is?
The concern described by some is that this intense focus on individual identity can become an endless psychodrama, potentially deepening individualism and having an anti-political nature. One author argues it strangely mirrors the anti-politics of neoliberalism, replacing collective action with a kind of pseudo-politics of identity in certain spheres.
And back to the conservative critique again, there's a worry mentioned that constantly expanding choices, like redefining marriage is used as an example, might unintentionally weaken the shared understanding and trust that freedom relies on.
Yes, and even the suggestion from that viewpoint that some people who call themselves liberals only really seem to support an open society if it's populated by other liberals.
Okay, so lots of internal strains. Now, let's link this to the rise of illiberalism and populism, which the sources tackle head on. They see it partly as a backlash.
Definitely. A reaction against the speed of change, globalization, integration, social and cultural liberalization. That feeling some people have, I don't recognize my country anymore.
It taps right into that sense of alienation we talked about.
Exactly. And the sources are quite specific about defining populism.
Yeah.
It's not just any anti-establishment movement.
What's the key differentiator?
It's the claim to be the only authentic moral representative of the real people. Populism constructs this idea of a single, unified popular will, and the leader claims, I am your voice. It's presented as a theoretical exercise, not interested in actual open debate.
And if they lose elections?
They might, as the sources note Trump did before the 2016 election, claim it was rigged or point to conspiracies to explain why the silent majority supposedly wasn't heard.
It's interesting how the sources link populism and technocracy. They seem like opposites.
But the argument is they share a core feature. Both are anti-pluralism. The technocrat says there's only one rational policy, experts know best, no need for messy politics. The populist says there's only one authentic will of the people, I know best, no need for deliberation. Both cut out citizen choice and debate.
That's a sharp point. The sources also discuss illiberal democracy, but they seem critical of the term itself.
Yes, there's an argument that while it rightly critiques governments that ignore checks and balances, calling them illiberal democracies, accidentally validates their democratic credentials.
Which allows leaders like Orban or Kaczynski to say, see, we're democratic, just not liberal.
Exactly. And the danger, according to these authors, is blurring the line between liberalism as a broad philosophy and liberal constitutionalism, rule of law, independent courts, minority rights, which they argue is actually fundamental to any meaningful democracy.
So their preferred framing is
That countries like Hungary aren't illiberal versions of democracy. They are states that might hold elections so they look democratic in that narrow sense, but they are not liberal. They feature this tightening grip by one party or leader, using the law against opponents, sometimes acting outside the law entirely, what the sources call juridical and extrajuridical violence, and hollowing out independent institutions.
This all points to a decline in constitutionalism itself, doesn't it? Not just the rules, but the spirit behind them.
Precisely. The sources emphasize it relied on a constitutional spirit, a shared commitment to the norms, the checks and balances. The crisis comes when that spirit just evaporates.
And they even use early U.S. history to show this isn't entirely new. The fights between Adams and Jefferson, the midnight judges.
Yeah, those examples show the system was always vulnerable if the key players stopped respecting the underlying norms and the spirit of the institutions. Fragility was baked in a way.
Okay, another huge challenge highlighted is corruption, called the ultimate frontier.
That's the phrase used, yeah. Because in societies dominated by particularism, where it's all about who you know, connections, favors the system, inherently benefits those already in power.
Creates impunity for the elites and forces everyone else into just survival mode, patronage, bribes, bending rules.
Right. And tackling that, the sources suggest, means building demand for good governance from the ground up, empowering citizens, fostering collective action. They look at examples like Botswana, where maybe traditional structures help limit it, or the U.S. described as competitive particularism, where elections came first and clean government sort of emerged gradually, messily, over time, pushed by reformers.
And they mention modern tools too, freedom of information laws, e-government, watchdog groups.
Yes, all potential tools for civil society.
Yeah.
But the underlying message is stark. Building ethical political organizations that can actually compete with patronage machines. That's a really tough long-haul fight.
Okay, let's widen the lens a bit. What about deeper forces, technology, history lessons?
Well, globalization and migration come up again, obviously. The sources describe them as having torn open divisions in both Europe and the U.S., major fault lines.
And there's a critique about foreign policy too, specifically U.S. efforts post-Cold War.
Yes, some sources argue that the push to actively spread democracy abroad was, in retrospect, a mistake.
Why? What was the reasoning?
The argument goes.
Yeah.
Trying to export liberalism often meant regime change. This pushed non-liberal states to resist hard, seek weapons, think Russia's actions, Iran, North Korea. It also, they argue, created failed states, led to costly occupations, increased terrorism risks.
Ironic.
It led liberal states themselves to adopt illiberal methods, targeted killings, mass surveillance to fight those threats, thereby undermining liberalism at home. A real paradox.
Then there's technology, the internet, smartphones, combined with migration, changing free speech.
Fundamentally changing the conditions, yes. On the one hand, amazing potential for communication, billions connected. On the other, huge dangers, like fatwas issued online, leading to real-world violence, inflammatory videos spreading instantly. The connected world has sharp edges.
There's also a specific point about network theory in the sources.
Right. The authors note we use the word network all the time, but maybe don't grasp their dynamics. The internet, as the biggest network ever, they argue, inherently promotes massive inequality.
How so?
It's put very simply. There are people who own a network and the people who use it. And the users generate the value that makes the owners billionaires. A structural inequality baked in.
And they look back historically at networks.
Yeah, contrasting maybe the decentralized networks of the Enlightenment correspondence, Freemasons, which were disruptive, potentially contributing to the French Revolution.
With the 19th century technologies.
Exactly. Telegraph, railways, telephone. These tended to reinforce hierarchy, central control, leading eventually to regimes like Stalin's that couldn't tolerate any uncontrolled networks. Hierarchy dominated by the mid-20th century before the internet shifted things again.
All this feeds into another major theme. The crisis in political communication, the rise of demagoguery.
Absolutely. They even bring in Thomas Hobbes, his idea that clear shared language is essential for society to avoid conflict, and Thucydides on the Peloponnesian War.
How words like justice lost their meaning.
Yes, how their meaning twisted over time to just mean the advantage of the strongest. When language breaks down like that, violence often follows, because people can't even debate meaningfully anymore.
So how do these sources define demagoguery today? What's its key tool?
Flattery. That's highlighted as the key method, confirming what listeners already think, playing on their weaknesses, creating a really strong us versus them feeling. The internet gives this global reach and often sparks nationalist pushback against foreign influence. But the core technique, flattery, isn't necessarily new.
But there's an inherent weakness to it.
Yes, the argument is it's a failure of realism. It encourages people to be self-centered, tribal, making it hard to deal realistically with others or the world. But, and this is crucial, it's also surprisingly resistant to reality checks
Why is it so sticky?
because the flattery creates moral confusion. It subtly shifts meanings, reinforces biases, and makes the listeners feel complicit, like co-authors of the ideas. That makes it really hard to admit you were wrong. Denial sets in. And the warning is clear. Even educated elites can fall for this if they're flattered or targeted as the enemy.
Okay, so given this pretty daunting picture, what about responses? How do the sources suggest we move forward?
Well, one strong perspective is that defenders of open societies need to do more than just defend the status quo. They need to be willing to rethink democracy itself.
Meaning what, exactly?
Meaning offering people who feel left out or ignored more than just voting every few years and dealing with bureaucracy. The argument is that a reimagined open society needs to restore a real sense of agency for citizens.
This leads to that idea of post-electoral democracy.
Exactly. The idea isn't to get rid of elections. They're crucial for peaceful transitions.
Yeah.
51 beating 49 without violence. But elections alone aren't enough anymore. Their democratic quality has declined. The argument goes too much focus on presidents, falling turnout, simple slogans, plus rising inequality makes the whole society of equals idea feel hollow.
So rethinking democracy means more complexity, broader representation.
Yes, adding layers beyond just electing MPs or a president. The sources suggest principles like legibility, making government actively understandable, not just transparent data dumps. Responsibility, real accountability, not just resigning. And responsiveness, actually reacting to citizens' input.
Making power feel more like a relationship.
Precisely. And it also demands qualities from leaders' integrity, truth-telling, they use the Greek word parrhesia, to rebuild that broken trust.
What about dealing with populists directly?
The sources say there's really no alternative to engagement, to debate, and deliberation. You have to hope the unforced course of the better argument can eventually win out. Sounds a bit idealistic, maybe, but what's the alternative?
But not just debating anything, drawing lines.
Yes, drawing red lines. When the argument shifts from legitimate policy debates, like immigration levels, to clear conspiracy theories, like a secret plot to replace the population, challenge it directly. Demand evidence or call for silence on those specific claims. The hope is the wider audience won't want to associate with outright conspiracy, even if they share some other concerns.
So defend core principles, engage, but call out the dangerous stuff.
That seems to be the approach advocated. Defend rights, accountability, open debate, tolerance, education, skeptical inquiry. Attacking institutions like universities that uphold these is seen as a huge blunder.
And the conclusion sections, they offer some concrete actions.
They do. Resist abandoning core principles, obviously. Hold illiberal states accountable, but also hold their enablers accountable. That could be other states violating refugee laws, democracies selling arms to dictators, banks handling corrupt money.
And a warning from history.
Yeah, don't make the mistake of the 1930s. Don't see freedom being crushed elsewhere as someone else's problem. The sources argue open societies tend towards peace with each other, while authoritarians need enemies first internal, then external. If they consolidate power, they become a threat to everyone.
Wow. Okay, that's quite a journey we've taken through these sources. From the origins of the open society idea, through all its internal difficulties, the modern pressures of populism, illiberalism, technology, different critiques, potential responses.
It really covers a lot of ground. And it's clear the challenges aren't simple. They're all tangled together, political, social, economic, cultural, technological, just as these essays lay out.
And the final takeaway from the sources. It seems to be less about external enemies and more about the struggle within our own societies.
Very much so, including the subtle ways we ourselves might be complicit or manipulated or just complacent.
They seem to warn against easy answers, right? Either thinking history is automatically on freedom's side or giving into pessimism that it's all doomed.
Exactly. History isn't predetermined. The sources suggest we have to actively rethink and fight for open society ideals, face the complexities, and resist, simplistic narratives or fooling ourselves.
So it really leaves you, the listener, thinking. Given this complex landscape mapped out in the sources, what part will you play?